Forse così va bene anche senza il microfono? Stiamo risolvendo gli ultimi problemi tecnici anche in questo nuovo palazzo, la nuova sala. Grazie. Allora, buonasera a tutti, benvenuti in questa, anche come ho detto, nuova sala nel Palazzo d'Azeglio per una conferenza particolare, anche eccellente e molto particolare e bello, perché io sono molto contento che Frédéric Rademacher è qui con noi e come sapete lui parlerà anche in inglese, quindi faccio io anche l'introduzione in inglese e così sì, usiamo tutto l'inglese, invece per i nostri ospiti qui c'è anche una traduzione simultanea. Allora, Frédéric Rademacher is an expert in ancient material technologies and provenance. He obtained his PhD at the Institute of Archaeology, University College London in 2015 and subsequently held the postdoc positions at the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the KU Leuven. In 2021, he joined the Department of Scientific Research at the British Museum as an inorganic materials scientist. Frédéric has studied metals from prehistoric times up to the 19th century and across Europe to Central Africa. Yet much of his work, his scientific work, focuses on ancient metallurgy, particularly in Egypt and the Sudan. And among his works as a metal scientist in the British Museum, he has also participated in many archaeological field missions in Egypt and the Sudan, among which I want to mention Amarna, Tel El Amarna, Ain Sukhna on the Red Sea, Kerma in Nubia, Pyramesi in the Egyptian Nile Delta, and Wadi al-Jarf again on the Red Sea. And Frédéric has also collaborated with many different European museum collections and has worked on their metal objects in their care. He is currently the principal investigator also of a 3-year Arts and Humanities Research Council / German Research Foundation funded project assessing the interactions between high temperature crafts during the Egyptian New Kingdom, which he was jointly awarded with his co-principal investigator Anna Hodgkinson at Freie University Berlin. We also in the past have collaborated on a number of projects dedicated to ancient Egyptian metallurgy, particularly in terms of bronze casting. Our first contact also goes back to almost 10 years when I was working at Bonn University on a project studying ancient Egyptian casting molds for casting little figurative bronzes, and this was our main point of contact. I also have collaborated a few years ago with the British Museum, an archaeological research excavation at Amara West in Sudan. And thanks to the gracious allowance of the Sudanese government, we were able to ship a number of samples from a small metallurgical workshop to the British Museum, where they are currently kept. And Frédéric Rademacher is also currently working on studying, analyzing a number of objects from Amara West. So also this is another project in which we intensely collaborate. Well, and then I want to finish what I'm going to say. I'm very happy that you're here, Fred, and I hope also for you this is a wonderful chance to hear recent research and an overview about copper alloys in ancient Egypt, presenting recent insights from interdisciplinary approaches here by one of the, I believe, may I say, leading experts when it comes to copper metallurgy in Pharaonic Egypt and Nubia. And I think that after this presentation, you will surely know why I was characterizing Fred as such a person. So, but I don't want to continue talking that much, so I would leave the floor to you, Fred. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you.
Ok, is this microphone? Ok. Prima di iniziare vorrei ringraziare gli organizzatori e i miei colleghi del Museo Egizio per invitarmi a presentare la mia ricerca qui e è molto piacere per me di essere qui oggi. So I will continue in English from here on. Today I'll be talking, as Johannes introduced, about copper alloys in ancient Egypt. This is not an exhaustive overview of all the research that's ever happened. This would take many presentations. What I want to focus on is recent research that I have been a part of, and also outlining some of the main questions that are currently in the field. And before starting, I really want to emphasize that this is not just my work, but I have been fortunate to work with a wide range of people, and so their work is heavily featured in this presentation. And for me, this started with my PhD research in Cantir, in Piramesse, with my PhD supervisor, Thilo Rehren, and the late Edgar Pusch, who was the field director there. And then during my postdoc, I moved on and started working at Ain Sukhna, Wadi al-Jarf and Kerma, together with another archaeometallurgist coming more from an archaeology, Egyptology background, Georges Verly, and we've been collaborating closely for the last 10 years now. And his work will also be in my presentation quite a bit. And at Ain Sukhna and Wadi al-Jarf, I've worked with Claire Somaglino and Pierre Tallet, site directors, and with Séverine Marchi and Charles Bonnet in Kerma. And then more recently, I've been collaborating with Anna Hodgkinson in Amarna since 2019, then also still with Barry Kemp, who passed away recently. And in Leuven, in the laboratory, I've been working closely for many, many years with Professor Patrick de Giese, who's been a mentor in the archaeological material analysis for me, and we continue to collaborate today. And then, as Johannes mentioned, I've collaborated with him, had the opportunity to work on material from Kubbat el Hawa and Amara West, also with Neil Spencer. And so these are some important people, and there are many more, I can't mention everyone, from different excavation projects, experimental sites. In particular, in Mel, I want to thank Florian Terejol. And then at the different museums where I've been able to collaborate in Brussels, in Leiden, and in London, a variety of curators, conservators, and various staff. And not least, since 4 years now at the British Museum, I'm very fortunate to work with a wide range of specialists. So this, I think, is important. It's not just my work which I'm presenting today. So if we want to look at ancient Egyptian metallurgy, there are a few important early studies I'd like to mention. From 1926 and 27, there's 2 volumes, one by Lucas on ancient Egyptian materials and industries, which has a chapter on metallurgy, and then in 27, Garland and Bannister's volume on ancient Egyptian metallurgy. And these contain a lot of insights, but are perhaps a bit more difficult to work with nowadays because a lot of the reasoning behind these insights is not captured in these volumes, and some of the analysis they did, for example, doesn't feature specific details of how they did it and sometimes which objects were analyzed. But they are some foundational works. And then the overview volume by Nicholson and Shaw on ancient Egyptian materials and technology from 2000 is another important volume with a chapter by Jack Ogden summarizing the knowledge on metal production in Egypt. But that, in the meantime, is 25 years ago. And so there has been a growing interest in the analysis and the understanding of metallurgy in Egypt in the 21st century, with new data coming out of excavation and survey, and also more archaeological science being included in these studies. And we've tried to summarize together with Martin Odler and Johannes in a recent encyclopedia entry in the UCLA Encyclopedia of Egyptology, an overview of these recent developments. And I'm not going to give a complete overview of that, but I recommend having a look if you're interested. This paper is freely available online. But so today I really want to focus on some of the new insights and outstanding questions that I've been involved in. Now, why do we want to study ancient technologies and specifically metallurgy? I think there is a clear interest out of trying to understand how technologies evolved as a history of technology and trying to look at the human ingenuity behind it and appreciating the people behind these technologies, which is in their own right very interesting. But as archaeologists, we want to look at the broader picture behind these technologies and understand why people did things in certain ways, made certain technological choices, because these are embedded in particular social, cultural contexts, economic contexts, environmental contexts, which constrain a technology, but in the same way also have an influence on society and culture. And so it's this going back and forth, understanding society through technology, which I think is very interesting. And it also allows us to look at processes of the invention, the diffusion, the adaptation of technologies, and looking at traditions and how these change over time. Beside the technologies themselves, there's also the materials that are being used. So we can look at where materials were being sourced from on the one hand, but also looking at how people engaged with these materials. And more broadly, we can look at the whole chain of production, which we'll come to in a moment, which is known as the chaîne opératoire, but also broader networks of production and try to reconstruct how these were organized. And to do this, we look on the one hand in great detail at individual objects, but then we can zoom out to how these were made in a workshop context, how those workshops functioned within a particular site, and how a site can be part of a network of production within Egypt and even within the broader Mediterranean region. So these are all different scales of analysis which we're trying to look at more or less simultaneously in a way. So if we think of copper, we need to think of copper alloys. If we look at the history of copper in Egypt, from the very beginning, alongside pure copper, we have an alloy of copper, which is a mixture of copper and arsenic, a type of bronze, if you like. And we see this already in the earliest pre-dynastic bronzes. And this remains the dominant alloy throughout the Old Kingdom into the Middle Kingdom period. During the Middle Kingdom, we slowly see the introduction of tin bronze, which is a mixture of copper and tin. And this is then the dominant alloy throughout Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. And in the later phase of the New Kingdom, we see the introduction of lead into tin bronze alloys. However, these are broad sort of lines in alloy use. We have examples of very early tin bronzes. We also see the parallel use, for example, of arsenical copper and tin bronze in these transition phases, and even mixtures of arsenic, tin, and copper are being used. So none of this is absolutely linear, and there's still a lot of detail to be extracted there. Now, before we dive in, I want to give a brief overview of how copper is produced, and this is a sort of general framework. It starts in the natural world with the extraction of copper ore, which are minerals very rich in copper, which are being mined, and then they are smelted, which means copper is extracted from them at a high temperature, which gives us raw copper. And this copper can then be remelted in a crucible and made into an object. And at that stage, you might also add things like tin to create a bronze. Now, this is a typical pathway, but there's many different ways of doing this, and it's that diversity as well which we are trying to capture in our research. So what sources do we have to look at copper in ancient Egypt? On the one hand, and this is the most important source, of course, there is archaeological excavation. And from excavation, we get different types of evidence. On the one hand, copper and copper alloy objects, in context of daily use, in settlement contexts. But the vast majority that we find, for example, in our museums, tends to come from a funerary context where they were deposited. Then we also have production sites where we can find the remains of the production of metallurgical activity. And there is also evidence from epigraphy, for example, from tomb scenes and expedition inscriptions. This we can complement with archaeological science, so the analysis of materials, which is, let's say, my bread and butter, which I've been involved with most. And then there is also experimental archaeology, which is increasingly giving additional information on how we interpret all of that. And so I'll just give some examples of copper alloy finds, which probably many of you have seen before. These are quite exceptional assemblages of high status prestige objects. But even though many of these are, for example, on displays in big museums, we don't know exactly how they were made. And this is something which we will have a PhD student starting early October looking specifically at these assemblages in the British Museum. But these are quite well known, have been published from the early excavations, for example, of Petrie, and have been instrumental in establishing also typologies of these different object types. And some have been analyzed in the past. For example, there is a catalog from 1987 from the British Museum, which holds information on the composition of a big group of artifacts from the British Museum, but also the Ashmolean Museum and the Petrie Museum. And these show, for example, from the Second Dynasty tomb of Khatsehemwy, that there are already objects made of tin bronze. And some of them are quite unique in the sense that they're composite, so the vessel you can see on the right is made of tin bronze, but the spout is made of arsenical copper. So very interesting early objects. If we look at epigraphy, I won't linger on this too much in the presentation because it's not something I've been working on a lot, but there is a lot of information there which we can contrast with other sources of information. And a lot of the tomb scenes focus on secondary metallurgy, so involving the melting and the casting of metal, and there is nothing really on the primary production there. When it comes to inscriptions, there are a lot, mostly related to mining expeditions and the exploitation of specific ore deposits, often in association with some smelting. And these give us a fairly good dating of expeditions that took place primarily in Sinai and the eastern desert of Egypt. If we look at those sites themselves, very few of them have been excavated, but a good number has been surveyed, so we have an idea of various sites. Unfortunately, many of them have been destroyed by modern mining, but there is still great potential, I think, for revisiting and excavating those archaeologically. And some of them are in really big scale. This example from South Sinai shows a mining trench of almost 1 kilometer long, so vast scale mining efforts. Another example from Senazip in Sinai, which has been surveyed but not fully excavated, showing a battery of almost 3,000 smelting furnaces, which is a huge scale of production, dated to the Old Kingdom, but again would require more excavation and study. One example which will come up several times in this presentation is Ain Sukhna, which is located on the west side of the Red Sea, so not on the Sinai Peninsula, is probably the best studied production site in the whole of Egypt, and with a phase in the Old and the Middle Kingdom, where we have a complete production chain of copper, where copper ore, which was mined in Sinai, was brought by boat to Ain Sukhna, was then smelted to produce raw copper, and then reworked in crucibles to be cast, and we also have arsenical copper on the site there. And there was a first publication in 2011 by Abdelrazik and colleagues, and then Georges Verly has recently finished his PhD, and we're working to publish that in hopefully the next year or so. But I will take some examples from this site in the rest of the presentation. Archaeological science, then, as another tool gives us a lot of detail on the composition of materials involved in this production chain. So we can look at the mineralogy, element composition, we can look at lead isotope ratios, microstructures. And the reason to do that is to understand which alloys were being used for objects, how they might have been made, and where the materials might have come from. And this kind of analysis is something we can do on site in Egypt or Sudan, but also in the lab. Obviously, there's no possibility to export samples from Egypt, so on site we do usually one type of analysis, and in the lab, being based in London, we tend to work on collection objects, and I've had the luck to work on various collections across Europe. Obviously, these present their own challenges in terms of having context available. Many of them were acquired in the 19th, 20th century, and often there is limitations in what we can do in terms of sampling these objects. But still, they present a great scope for in-depth study. Some of that can be non-invasive, and the Museo Egizio has done quite important work with recent publications using neutron and gamma tomography methods to look inside and closed shapes, and also to use techniques like XRF and XRD, which allow you to look at the microstructure and the composition. And one of the advantages of using such non-invasive methods is we can look at entire objects and look at variations on those objects. So that's a very important part of what we can do. What I do want to say is that in some cases it is essential to take a sample, and this is something I've done quite a bit. And for example, on the right you can see a very corroded fragment of metal, which on the surface has a composition that does not reflect the real composition of the metal. And so if we take a small sample using a drill, we can then use that sample to go through the lab where I digest it, and we can extract a lot more information using a sample. But this means we need to take a sample, and that's something we need to consider for every individual object, whether or not that will give us the information that we want. Another type of material that we can study are these production remains, and I've looked at a lot of crucibles. So these are used for melting copper or copper alloys. This is an example from Amarna, which I studied on site using a portable instrument. I did the same thing in Piramesse, and there we had samples from a museum, which we were able to cut and look at the cross-section. And this allows us to extract far more detail on the process within those crucibles. But as I said, on-site analysis is very important. And for example, at Ain Sokhna, where I've been collaborating for the last 10 years, in 3 seasons we've done almost 3,000 XRF analysis on site. So a huge amount of data, which allows us to really characterize the entire production chain on site. And this is far more analysis than we could do by sampling. So the non-invasive work really has its important role to play, especially on an excavation. And then finally, experimental archaeology. I will just give a few examples, but I won't go into too much depth. But we can do experiments on a very small scale, where I've made very small crucibles to look at specific interactions, which we then compare to real crucibles. And we can also do full-scale reconstructions, like you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, really reconstructing what we find in excavation to then better understand how those structures were used. And so it's really going back and forth between experiments, what we see on site, and what we can analyze that helps to improve our interpretation. And so among this, we've looked at different steps of the production chain. For example, the use of chisels, which was published in 2019, where we look at the traces on chisels used in quarrying context or mining context, which we can then compare to chisels found in archaeological context. Smelting, so these are models from smelting furnaces in Ain Sokhna. And what I want to emphasize, this is not just trying, this is really investing a lot of time and effort. We've done over 50 smelting experiments, which every individual experiment runs for a day and requires a day or two to prepare, just to give you an idea of the scale of these things. But which has allowed us to really understand how they functioned, which fuel was being used, wood rather than charcoal. So a very important study led by Georges. And then casting experiments as well. This is research that is still ongoing, where through casting in a furnace reconstructed after an excavated furnace in Kerma, we're better able to understand how this exceptional technology for casting these big plates of bronze functioned. So those are a few examples. Now, what are the sort of key questions that we ask when we're studying copper in ancient Egypt? Obviously, where was copper ore being mined? Where and how was it being produced, the copper? Was there any copper being imported into Egypt? How were the alloys produced? How were they used? And then how did all of that change over time? Because obviously we're talking about several millennia of pharaonic history. And do we also see variations in regional variations within Egypt and Nubia? So those are very big questions, and we're only starting to get to them, but those are the ones to keep in mind. Now, if we start with copper mining, what Georges has done is compile a database, which is based on all the inscription evidence from mining inscriptions, but also from earlier excavations to look at where precisely activity was taking place in Sinai. So there's an overview of identified sites. And in the Eastern Desert, some of them we know have activity, but it's not always perfectly dated. But it does give us a handle on where activities were in terms of mining over time. And so if we look at the Old Kingdom, based on the inscriptions, there are only very few mines identified, but this might be because a lot of the inscriptions at that stage were focused on the extraction of turquoise as a stone. And we know that alongside turquoise, there was also copper extraction. And if we compare this, so these are mining sites, to sites that have evidence for copper smelting, we see there are a lot more, which indicates a lot of mining activity in Sinai. The biggest analytical study that has taken place so far was published in 2012 by Abdelmotalib and colleagues, was a survey of these mining sites in Sinai and the Eastern Desert, where they looked at the dating based on pottery and identified these different mining sites. And they did an important set of analyses. So these are analytical data. I won't show too many of these. But just to give you an idea what people do when they analyze these ores and metals is to look at not just the copper that is in them, but also the other elements like cobalt, nickel, and antimony, which are characteristic of specific geological deposits that were mined, and also their lead isotope ratios, which is another geological characteristic of the age of the ore deposit. And we can use those to characterize mining deposits. And just to give a sort of general idea of how that works is if we have an ore, beyond the copper, it has a certain fingerprint, let's say, of trace elements, which is present in the ore. Some of those trace elements will remain in the copper as it is being smelted and in the copper alloy as it is being produced. Some of them are lost because of the metallurgical process, or their absolute amount changes. But it's an important tool. If we find certain trace elements in a copper alloy, we can exclude certain ores which don't have those trace elements. So this is one part of the analysis we can use. The other is lead isotopes, which are less affected by the metallurgical processes, and we can use them to compare more directly between and along the different stages of the production chain. I have to say, there are cases, for example, when there is not much lead in the copper ore, where the lead isotope ratios don't work as well as we would hope. But together with the trace element patterns, they are a powerful tool for us to look at where material might be coming from. So from the analysis of Abdelmoutalib and others, they drew the important conclusion that throughout the Sinai Peninsula and the Eastern Desert, the copper ores which they analyzed don't have many trace elements. So they're quite pure, and based on their research, they suggested that all of the copper that was being produced on these sites is very pure copper. And this is something which we've replicated. So in the museum in Brussels, we analyzed material from Petrie's excavations in Sinai, particularly for the Old Kingdom from Wadi Magara. And we found that all of the copper ore and the small bits of raw copper that was produced in these workshops was very pure. There was a bit of variability in the composition, but overall very pure, and it doesn't have any arsenic, which is an important thing to note because all of the objects in this time period do have arsenic, and I'll come back to that later. And if we look at the Middle Kingdom, based on the inscriptions, there's a slightly bigger range of sites that have been identified, whereas the production sites, there are a bit fewer. There might be a bias in the documentation, but still, there might be more of a concentration of these smelting activities at these sites. And an important one is Ain Sukhna, which, as you can see, is relatively far away from the mining sites in Sinai, but ore from those sites in Sinai was being transported by boat to Ain Sukhna. And here too, so we have good written and archaeological evidence for this, and based on the research that we've done, we find that the ores are very similar in composition to what we have in Sinai, and again, there is no arsenic in any of these copper ores. But we do see variability from ores probably coming from different mines in Sinai, and all of them being brought together at Ain Sukhna. Again, going back to the research we did in Brussels, we have also Middle Kingdom material from Petrie's excavations, and we see the same thing, very pure copper being produced, which indicates that arsenic was being added in another step. Now, I'm talking about pure copper being produced from these mining sites. What we have to remember is that alongside that, there is also an important economy of recycling. And we see more and more evidence for this from the Middle Kingdom onwards. So amongst the finds in these workshops on the top right, we find small bits of metal which are probably being collected as metal is being worked or cast to then be remelted and reused. And this is an example from Ain Sukhna. We also see there is a strong state control, particularly when it comes to tools, that as they are worn and broken, they get packed up and they get sent to probably state-controlled workshops for remelting. And there's also evidence, for example, from Papyrus Reisner for these practices. And this is also, apart from fresh copper being produced, an important part of the provisioning is also the recycling over time. And so that's important to keep in mind when we look at objects that we find, for example, in a funerary context. Their composition does not necessarily reflect a clean trajectory from a mine through a workshop straight into the tomb, but these objects might have been used for a long time, might have been composed of different objects that were recycled and melted together, so we need to keep that in mind when we look at the composition of an object, that it doesn't necessarily represent a linear production chain. But overall, the most common alloy type in the Old and the Middle Kingdom is arsenical copper, and this is something we've observed in our studies, but also others like Martin Odler and E.G. Kmoszek in their studies of museum collections, Graham Phillip and Mike Howell working on the Tel el-Dapa material. This comes back time and again. The arsenical copper is the main alloy. There are exceptions. As I said, during the Middle Kingdom, we see tin being used increasingly, often still in combination with arsenic, so a mixed alloy of copper, tin, and arsenic. But the arsenical copper is the main one. And this is really one of the big questions at the moment that we're working on. Although it has been noticed a long time ago, so Mike Cowell, in his analysis from these groups of museum objects in 1987, notes that based on his analysis, he thinks the arsenic must have been an intentional addition because the copper is very pure, which suggests an ore was being used to produce very pure copper, and the arsenic had to come with it, rather than having a copper that naturally contained arsenic in it. And this is quite important and somewhat contested perhaps as well, because in a lot of contexts across the ancient world, for example, in Italy, in Iberia, a lot of the ores are complex ores, and a lot of the early copper production produces natural alloys of copper with arsenic, with antimony, with different elements. But this seems to be a very different case in Egypt. And so what we've been able to do through our analyses of museum objects is to take this idea and expand it a bit further using this trace element and lead isotope analysis, which allows us to show that the copper that was being used is indeed consistent with copper coming from Sinai and Eastern Desert in trace elements and in lead isotope ratios, but the arsenic must have been added at another stage in the production chain. And this is for the pre-dynastic up to Old Kingdom material, and we see the same thing in objects from the Middle Kingdom and also production evidence that I showed earlier. So this is an important observation, and we see the same thing at Ain Sukhna, where we've, as I said, done almost 3,000 analyses of copper ore, smelting furnaces, raw copper, all of which has no arsenic in it whatsoever. But then when we look at the crucibles, we see that arsenic is coming in at this secondary stage. So this really implies this secondary production chain where arsenic is being added. Again, what I want to emphasize is that these are examples drawn together from different sites. We have to keep in mind that we don't, at this stage, know everything that happened from the pre-dynastic up to the Middle Kingdom. There is surely variation, which we will only start seeing as we look at more production evidence from different sites. Now, an important part of establishing that is not just looking at ore and objects, but also the things in between. And crucibles are a very important tool for that. And so I want to turn to the site of Kerma, where we've done analysis of metals from the site, which were published in 2022. And they show distinct parallels to what's happening in Egypt in the same time period. But 2 years ago, in 23, we also published a study of crucibles from Kerma, dated to the Middle Kerma period and associated with a large casting workshop just next to the Defufa in Kerma. And these crucibles come in different shapes, different sizes. There's a lot of variability there. Some of them are layered, made in different ways, and probably used for different processes, and I won't go into all the detail here. But importantly, there are a few crucibles that show evidence of arsenic copper production, because they contain tiny prills which are very rich in arsenic, which is something you wouldn't get if you're remelting an arsenical copper alloy. And it shows that they were adding some sort of arsenic-rich material to the crucible. And we see these prills here. There's a variety of things we can see under the microscope I won't go into here. But so we can identify the fact that something was being added. We, at this stage, don't know what. It could have been a mineral, such as arsenopyrite, or it could have been an intermediate man-made product, which we call spice. At this stage, we don't know. And what we also see at Kerma, because this is equivalent to the Middle Kingdom period, is they're also starting to use mixtures of arsenical copper and tin. And this implies that they were either melting, remelting tin bronze and adding arsenic, or making a new mixture of the three. We don't know. But they were apparently aiming for this ternary mixture. Now, the sources of arsenic, at this stage, we don't know. From geological surveys, there are a lot of potential sites, both in southern Sinai and in the Eastern Desert. But we have very little archaeological evidence for their exploitation. We don't know whether these were mined and used, and in which periods of time. Nor do we have any evidence for the production of spice, this potential product to produce arsenical copper. So this is a big gap in our current understanding. We do have a few examples that could be indicative. There's a find of arsenopyrite in the Second Dynasty El Kab, which may be associated to copper alloy production. This is one of the few examples. Another is a tentatively identified spice fragment from Tel Adaba from the 15th dynasty, which was analyzed by Philip N. Cowell. And there are current probable examples being studied by Martin Odler and Iji Gmoshek from Old Kingdom Giza and Middle Kingdom Elephantine, so we'll see when these are published what those look like. The only other example is from 18th dynasty Amarna. There was an identification published in 1995 by James Charles, and I've been fortunate to come across two spice fragments in the British Museum collection, which we were able to study less than 2 years ago. And I was allowed to take cross-section samples, which you can see on the top right, and these are images from under the microscope. It's a very pretty material to look at, but also very interesting. It shows a man-made material, very rich in iron and arsenic, that could be used to produce these arsenical copper alloys. And there are parallels from the late Bronze Age, from the Aegean world and Anatolia. And I am showing a lead isotope plot here. I won't show many more. But what we have found is that both in terms of microstructure, trace element composition, and lead isotope ratios, this spice from Amarna is identical to spice that was found in Telachana in eastern Anatolia and was probably made there. And so that's a very interesting observation. And there seems to be some sort of use in the late Bronze Age of spice in the Eastern Mediterranean world. We're not sure why, because at this point in time, tin bronze is the very strongly dominant alloy that is being used. There might be special occasions where people were still producing arsenical copper, and this material was being traded for that purpose. But again, a question for this period. And what I want to stress is that I don't think this practice and this kind of spice would have necessarily been used in earlier periods of Egyptian history, and we still need to find where arsenic was coming from. My feeling is that it's more likely that arsenic sources within Egypt would have been used to produce a steady, to maintain a steady production of arsenical copper throughout the pre-dynastic up to Middle Kingdom period. But this is an important open question. But this brings us to the New Kingdom and period, and in this period we see an important distinction in terms of metallurgical technology compared to the Middle Kingdom, although we can see the basis for it already in the Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate period. But so there's this transition to tin bronze in favor of arsenical copper. We see a change in the shapes of crucibles compared to earlier periods, which goes together with the use of pot bellows and tuyères instead of blowpipes and different heating structures. And I'll show an example in a moment. And it's been suggested that this is an influence coming from the Levant or Mesopotamia. And obviously the question there is how much of that is really an import of a technology or a negotiation of technology. Again, there is a lot to unpack by comparing with metallurgical technologies in these other regions. But just to show as an example, on the top we have an Old Kingdom scene where you can see blowpipes being used to heat a crucible, and these are of a type that have an opening at the front and air is being blown into it. Whereas in the New Kingdom from the 18th dynasty tomb of Rekhmire, you can see people using pot bellows which are operated by foot, and the air is being blown through a tuyere into a much more open crucible type, which is then lifted in a different way for casting. So it's a very different setup for secondary metallurgy. And you can see on the right that very large-scale casting, which has been suggested for monumental bronzes, for example, doors. And that brings me to Pyramesse, where I was able and fortunate to work for my PhD research on the metallurgical crucibles, which come from a production context, mass production, industrial level, let's say production context associated with the building of Pyramesse. Alongside copper, there was faience, pigments like Egyptian blue, and glass being produced. And so I studied these crucibles, both in the field and in the lab, and we were able to show that these were crucibles used to work bronze, and more specifically, based on the composition, again, of the prills, the metal that is embedded in these crucibles, we were able to show that they were making fresh bronze, so by adding a source of tin. And some of the inclusions suggest that this tin, at least in part of the production process, might have been cassiterite, which is a natural mineral of tin that we don't know where it might have come from, but could come from the eastern desert of Egypt. But alongside copper being traded in this point in time, we also know that tin ingots were being traded in the eastern Mediterranean, and these might also have come to a site like Pyramesse. Again, at these sites, there is strong evidence for the recycling of scrap metal, folded to be sent and wrapped in tissue to be sent to these big workshops. Another site I've recently worked on together with Anna Hodgkinson is an excavation of site M50 1416 at Amarna, where there is evidence for a variety, again, of high temperature products being made from glass, faience, etc. And I was called in to look at the crucibles. And what's really interesting at this stage is that having looked at different crucibles from the same period, we see they're very similar, but there are also minute differences. So we can start to look at variations in practices at different sites, for example, in how the crucible was made, how the clay was mixed, but also in terms of how crucibles were taken care of. And for example, at Amarna, we see there are more repairs of crucibles, which might mean that people working in these workshops take better care of their crucibles because they're using them, they're curating them for a longer period of time, whereas in the industrial setting at Pyramesse, they were more batch produced on a large scale, let's say. So different approaches to these materials. And the analysis of these materials from Amarna is coming out hopefully in a couple of weeks as a monograph led by Anna. And there's a variety of different metallurgical remains that are presented there as well, but I won't go into here. And then finally, as another comparative point, I want to mention Amara West, which Johannes has already mentioned in the introduction, which was a center for colonial administration in New Kingdom in Nubia. And we've done a first study of the copper alloys, and so what we can do is compare their composition to more or less contemporaneous copper alloys in Middle Egypt, in the Nile Delta, and we do see variations between them, which indicates that there are different provisioning networks at the same time in different regions in the Nile Valley. And as part of this research, we're also then going to perform a study on the crucibles, which we can compare. They look similar, but we'll compare in more detail to Amarna and Pyramesse. But so, in a sort of broader perspective for the New Kingdom, based on the inscriptions, there's a relatively limited number of mines that are indicated, and also a limited number of smelting workshops, which might mean there's a narrowing focus on particular mines. It doesn't necessarily mean there's less copper being produced during the New Kingdom. On the contrary, if we look at some of the sites that have been tentatively dated to the New Kingdom, sometimes the scale of production is enormous. For example, at Bir Nazib, there is an estimated 5,000 tons of copper that was produced at that site, with a very big proportion of that being New Kingdom. And there is ongoing excavation there now, which will hopefully refine that chronology. But fewer inscriptions doesn't necessarily mean less copper production. And as I said, we need to keep in mind that recycling economy was playing a big part during the New Kingdom. And then there is the role of international exchange, and this is something which obviously is conspicuously depicted in these tomb scenes, and there is definitely evidence for the exchange of copper that is in circulation in the Eastern Mediterranean, but we're not sure how important that was to the overall copper production in Egypt. We know that some of the copper ingots that have been studied are actually quite poor quality and were not necessarily appreciated by the end users, even if they were part of a sort of prestige exchange economy. And if we look at the composition of these ingots, we see in the assemblages that we've studied actually very few that are consistent with Cypriot copper, these oxide ingots. We see some copper coming from Timna and Feinan, which is a major production center in modern-day Israel and Jordan. But then a lot of the copper that is in circulation seems to be consistent with copper from Sinai or recycled material from earlier periods. And there is a strong clustering in one end which doesn't necessarily correspond to any mining area, but which might indicate particular practices of stockpiling during the New Kingdom. There's a lot to unpack there, which we won't go into here. But what is important, I think, to remember is that when we look at the composition of copper alloy, we need to think of it, as in archaeology, as a sort of palimpsest, where different processes contribute to that composition. On the one hand, there's regional variation, but there's the important effect of metallurgical practice, so the smelting, the alloying, the mixing by recycling that we need to keep in mind when we try to understand these assemblages. And there's also economic systems at play. For example, large amounts of copper might have been stockpiled in royal institutions, kinds of hoarding, which keep copper out of circulation for a longer period of time. There might be big influxes of copper, for example, for a large-scale project like we have at Bir Amesse, where a batch of copper might be imported from Cyprus, or a lot of material might be mined in Sinai specifically for a large-scale production event, and a lot of copper might then go into only a handful of objects rather than all these small objects that we find. And there's the recycling of them over time. And it's important to note that we know some of these very large objects were being produced, but we rarely, if ever, find any of them. So all of those large-scale castings tend to be then, in later points in history, broken up and remelted to be used in other objects. But so when it comes to sourcing, this idea of copper provenance, in some cases, we find at Bir Amesse a fragment of an oxide ingot that matches perfectly with oxide ingots that we find in shipwrecks, which in turn match to production in Cyprus. So this is very clear. But I think in most cases, when we're looking at objects, we shouldn't expect to find such a clear pattern, and we need to rather compare them to objects from the same period and see how they vary, and to sort of think of the composition of objects as a group of material that is in circulation at a certain point in time in a certain region, and look at how that changes rather than each individual object. And what is important there is looking at assemblages from sites, from workshops, and to have points in time and space that give us an idea of what a composition was coming, for example, out of a particular workshop. And again, the analysis plays an important role there, but it's by comparing it to the written evidence, the field evidence, and what we understand based on the experimental work that we come to a better conclusion than by using one line of evidence by itself. So to finish up, I think some of the key challenges that we're facing with this research is that we need more excavation and dating of mining sites to look at and to characterize the ore that was being extracted. We need to look at more production waste, which often is sort of neglected in a way in material studies, but it's what we need to really come to terms with the diversity of technological practices and to look at how these technological traditions evolved. We need to look at more objects from different time periods, different sites, to compare how the selection and the use of material changed over time. And then to really come to terms, we need to also invest time in reproducing some of the processes that we identified to really understand in a very fine way how these were conducted. And experimental archaeology, I think, has to play a role there. And as a final challenge, I think I've been talking about copper as if it exists in isolation, but it doesn't. Some parts of the production chain might do. For example, the mining is probably just focused on copper production, although there might be other minerals such as turquoise and others being mined in the same environments and expeditions. But the production of things like glass, faience, and Egyptian blue, it often sits in the same context as copper alloy production. And so in this project, which Johannes introduced, I'm working together with Anna Hodgkinson to look specifically at these interactions between different high-temperature crafts. And this is something which Anna has been working on for a long time, looking at specifically New Kingdom, Late Bronze Age settlement sites, urbanism, and the spatial organization of crafts in these settlements. And she's also investigated more specifically the production of glass. And it's something I've come across in some of my work looking at, for example, Egyptian blue, where we see that bronze is being used as a colorant rather than pure copper. And this is something we haven't first discovered. This was already indicated in 1983 by previous research, and I think is something worth following up to really see those interactions between these materials. And so what we want to do is look at how craft spaces were being shared for the production of different materials, to what extent the resources were being shared, so how copper figures in the production of these different vitreous materials, but also how the other components of vitreous materials were being shared, so sand and flux that are being used. And then finally, as another component, looking at the way those materials are being produced, whether they use the same heating structures, the same technical ceramics like crucibles, or how they are adapted, and if we can see the same people behind these processes, or at least an exchange of knowledge between people involved in these processes. And so that's what we're hoping to do in this project, but that will be something for another presentation. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Fred, for this amazing, detailed, rich overview of what we currently know about bronze metallurgy in ancient Egypt. Are there indeed immediate questions? Ci sono domande, curiosità?
Could you say at least a few words about the techniques, technologies that were used in the first steps of production, like mining and or dressing, crushing or picking, whatever?
Yeah. So there's not that much detailed study on the subject. What we see in what's received more attention is from quarrying settings. So for the extraction of stone, that's been better studied, where we know there's different types of hard stones like granite being used for a lot of the extraction, and chisels of copper alloy are being used to some extent. Again, this varies in which phase of the extraction, but that's for quarrying. For mining, there's not been much study, to my knowledge, detailed study of how that was done. We expect the use of the same tools, and there are these hammer stones that are found on the mining sites, but there is no detailed study of the different steps of the extraction. What we know from other sites like Timna, which have been better studied, and Feinan, these are the tools that are being used, so predominantly stone tools, and then to some extent metal tools. And fire setting is sometimes part of that as well, although it's not always so easy to identify. But so setting fire to a face in the mine to weaken the rock and then remove a layer. But yes, there is more work to be done there, and the same when it comes to ore beneficiation, so removing material that is unwanted from the rich mineral. We don't see much of that. We don't have much evidence from the mining sites. I can say at a site like Ain Sokhna, they seem to be receiving relatively clean ore. So it's probably any sort of extra material is being removed on the mining site, which makes sense because it is then shipped to Ain Sokhna. So they are getting purified ore at a smelting site like Ain Sokhna. Yeah.
Further follow-up questions from the audience? If not, I also have a question. You mentioned the term knowledge several times in your presentation. And I would like to ask you, what is the current idea of how the knowledge of using all these kind of methods, approaches, technologies have been transmitted over time? I mean, if I would be an Egyptian, how could I learn to do this? What is our current understanding of how all these kind of practices and things were performed, and by whom, and how, let's say, these traditions and ideas were taught, or how this worked, you know?
I think this is something where your kind of research is important, from, for example, prosopography and looking at the names and of the people involved, which is something I have relatively limited knowledge of. I think looking at studies in technology more broadly in the ancient world, it seems to be a question of apprenticeship and whether that is within a family or not. I don't think we'll ever come to that stage, but I would expect these things to go through long periods of apprenticeship, and they're based on what I know of these organization of craft units. There are master overseers, and then workmen. So the tasks are delegated, and you get specialists leading a team. But the specialists, I think, would have been sort of full-time craftspeople. Although that then again might vary depending on the context. If we look at a site like Amarna, we see probably the same people in a more domestic context involved in production of different materials. So again, that varies probably depending on the context and the time period.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience?
Grazie per la bella conferenza, e io vorrei fare una domanda di questo tipo, cioè se abbiamo una sorta di conoscenza su coloro che lavoravano nelle miniere. Cioè, ad esempio, noi abbiamo anche una descrizione di Diodoro Siculo per ciò che riguarda l'estrazione dell'oro, e quindi un po' della condizione di chi estraeva questo minerale. Abbiamo invece, per ciò che riguarda il rame in queste miniere, abbiamo una sorta di descrizione in qualche modo dei lavoratori che estraevano il materiale?
So, could someone, I think this is a question about the selection of ores depending on their color, is that right, or no?
No, it's what we know about those people who were working in the copper mines. So, because let's say Diodorus Siculus, now we have these texts, and he speaks about the gold miners in the Eastern Desert and about their conditions and the technologies applied. And the question is, do we have the same evidence, or what do we know about the people being employed in extracting copper ores?
Yes, this is something, honestly, I don't know much about. There might be written evidence about this, but it's not something I have the background for, so I'd prefer not to give an answer rather than a wrong answer, I have to say. I'm not sure. I think, no,
I would also add in this regard, as an Egyptologist, that in this case, let's say the written sources don't really focus on particularly those people. We have the expedition inscriptions, and they were also made and commissioned by rather middle or high-ranking members of those expedition forces that went to the mining sites. And in those inscriptions, we sometimes have then long lists of the participants, and then we have a number of 17,000 men, or 5,000 men, or 100, and this is then the actual workforce of those people who would extract the ore. I mean, this is something that we also know better from those inscriptions in the Wadi Hammamat, for instance, so for the stone quarrying expeditions. So there is lots of textual data about it, and then in terms of the gold mining activities as well, because they were also meaningful and key for the Egyptian state to control and to display their ability to kind of create and organize such big expeditions to mine these prestigious materials. But copper in this regard, looking at the epigraphical data, so the textual data, there is not that much focusing on this material. And this applies also what Frederick said, that also in the Sinai, most of these texts speak about turquoise, of Mefkat, so this mineral that was mined there, but the dimension or the side of metal, copper ore extraction is not that much featured in those texts. Other pressing questions from the audience?
Però dovrei chiedere a lei che lo traduca. Gli scalpelli di bronzo che noi abbiamo nel museo egizio, come facevano a scolpire quando una scala di messo del granito arriva a 7-8? Come facevano a scolpire con scalpelli piccolissimi e incisioni di millimetri?
Okay. The question is about the use of bronze chisels of different kind of sizes by the ancient Egyptian stone cutters or relief specialists using those bronze chisels of different sizes to also carve detailed hieroglyphic inscriptions in monumental stones like the Gem and Ferbak coffin lid or other kind of basalt or other hard stone objects. So the question is, what do we know about the use of copper tools or bronze chisels as working tools for creating these kind of fine detailed, also small scale hieroglyphic text or other iconographical elements?
Yeah, I think, again, this is something I have not done, this is not something I've done personal research on. As far as I know, there's no direct indications, but these are the tools that were available that we know of from this time period. And there have been experimental studies recreating such incisions using bronze tools that show this level of detail can be recreated in the hard stones that were present. And I think it's the work by Stocks, for example, that has shown this replication by replication, but we don't have, I think, any sources specifically mentioning how it was done, but it's been shown experimentally that it can be done using these tools.
And let's say, on the other hand, also the presence of these kind of chisels of different sizes in museum collections, sì, la presenza di questi scalpelli di piccole dimensioni o grande parlano proprio sul loro uso, no? E c'è anche un'altra idea anche di Dennis Stocks, che anche il selce, o la selce è almeno stato usato per anche incidere, creare rilievi in calcare. No? Sì, non proprio scalpelli, ma piccoli pezzi, perché anche dipende sempre dal materiale, no? Pietra, ci sono anche diverse scale della durezza, no? Lei ha anche menzionato la scala Mohs. Per pietre meno dure anche selce è stato usato, invece ovviamente per granito, granodiorite, basalto hanno dovuto usare scalpelli di bronzo. There was another question.
Italiano o inglese? Yes, in English. My question is very simple. So, is there any reference of periods of time where the production of copper was like blooming or something like that? There was like a golden era of extracting. Maybe you mentioned.
So it's a good question. It's something, as Johannes was saying, we have evidence of these mining campaigns in certain periods of time where we know they went somewhere based on an inscription, but we don't always know how much copper was then extracted. And looking at production sites and looking at, for example, the stratigraphy of production waste might be a better indicator to see how much was being produced at these production sites, but we don't have very good excavation evidence. So for example, at a site like Einsuchna, which was operating in only 3 big campaigns probably, we have about 100 smelting furnaces, which were not all operating at the same time, but even if we subdivide them across these campaigns, having 30 smelting furnaces operating in one, smelting campaign is an enormous scale of production, and they weren't producing, 100 grams of copper. So these are big masses of copper, but being produced. Coming to exact numbers is always going to be very difficult, I think. But looking at the scale of some of these production sites, also in Sinai, where we have batteries of kilometers long, and we have slag heaps at a site like Bir Nazib, which probably come to the equivalent of several thousands of tons of copper being produced. Production is enormous, but the chronology is not that very clear at this stage. We need better excavation and dating of those sites, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I think I would like to close the conference also, and using also your term, the golden age of copper production. I like the choice of words, and I think also with Fred, you heard a representative of the golden age of research, of archaeological and archaeometrical research on copper, or copper bronze, or tin bronze, or all these kind of materials. And this is also something that is a recent trend in Egyptology, or in our approach on pharaonic culture on the one hand, but also on the objects that the ancient Egyptians made. And this is something that also you as visitors or friends of Museo Egizio see in most recent museum installations like Materia, Forma del Tempo, where we put our focus also on materials and the research on materials and the understanding of materials, and in this way also Fred's approach and work and study of bronze and copper alloy properly falls into this area of interest that really characterizes cutting-edge modern Egyptology / material science. Thank you.
Thank you.